Hold on. Lights. Got those. Camera. Action. Yes. Right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I take great pleasure in introducing Alex Dean this afternoon. Alex is the director of Big Brother Watch, which is, as its name suggests, a most excellent organisation. When I began writing about surveillance, identity cards, money laundering, and all those other things 20 years ago, I found that there was a shortage of any other material on these things, and so I had to make it all up myself. Nowadays, there is no shortage of material about the surveillance society. On the other hand, whereas 20 years ago, the surveillance society was something we were looking forward to, nowadays, the surveillance society is something very much with us. In the week that Chris Tame died, in the third week of March 2006, I spoke at a free speech rally in Trafalgar Square. It was raining very heavily on that day, and what struck me the most about the meeting was that there were more police officers there in Trafalgar Square with video cameras, still cameras, and God knows what, than there were people listening in the audience. And I thought then, this isn't the England in which I grew up. The England in which I grew up was a place where you could go along, deliver a ranting speech about how the Jews ate your mother-in-law, and you'd have a police constable down there saying, move on, sir, move on. And that's the people who want to throw rotten eggs at you. Whereas in 2006, turn up in Trafalgar Square with all manner of luminaries, including Peter Tatchell, and you've got the full apparatus behind you of a police state. Now, Big Brother is watching you. He's watching you in almost everything you do. And one of the few things that I find heartening about this situation is that there are organisations like Big Brother Watch which are looking back at Big Brother, and I'm sure he doesn't like it, and I hope that Alex will tell us more about how he is watching Big Brother. So I give you Alex Dean. Thank you.
Sean, thank you very much for that generous introduction, and can I thank the Libertarian Alliance for having me to speak today. Since we settled on this topic, anonymity is not a crime, I must tell you that things have developed somewhat. And I say this as a member of the Conservative Party. They have developed for the worse under this government. The Intercept modernisation programme, about which many of you will already know, was controversial enough that its development was suspended under the Labour government. Now, things had to be pretty bad on the authoritarian stakes before Gordon Brown and his cabinet would suspend something. But the retention of everyone's telephone calls and emails was that thing. That was a programme controversial enough that Labour stopped developing it. The Conservative Party had a commitment to reverse the rise of the surveillance state, ironically launched as a paper at Microsoft, but there we are, and the Liberal Democrats had a similar commitment. And furthermore, in their coalition agreement, both parties who are now in government agreed to stop building databases on people without good reason. And there was the catch, in their view, without good reason. The Intercept modernisation programme is now back with us. It was revealed under the spending review, tucked away, I must tell you, not front and centre, but tucked away as an ability to retain communications monitoring for the security services and the police. That is to say that details of telephone calls and emails will be going ahead in this country, and that your telephone calls and emails will be monitored by the state. Not a conspiracy theory, a government policy. I debated this on Sky recently with a member of the police force, and he said, "You don't seem to appreciate, Alex, how useful it would be for the state to have records of everyone's telephone calls and emails." Well, I'm sure that it would be useful. I'm sure that it would be useful for the state if everyone coming to a Libertarian Alliance event had to register their speech in advance, or we had a member of the Stasi who would come and sit and monitor what we were saying, just for your own good, comrade. Usefulness to the state is not the only criteria by which you measure public policy, and we must never allow it to be the only measure by which you evaluate public policy. I point to what this represents. In my view, it effectively represents the reversal of the presumption of innocence. It represents a reversal of the belief that you, as a member of the public, going about your business, absent the suggestion that you've done anything wrong, are entitled to the presumption of innocence. Now, worse news, of course, it's not the first example of such policies, but I think it is the worst. It didn't come first, but I think when you start listening to everybody's telephone calls and emails as a matter of course, that is the worst possible so far. What else has there been? Stop and search without reasonable suspicion. You may have seen the figures announced this very week by the Metropolitan Police and the British Transport Police, showing that in the last year they stopped and searched 100,001 people, something like that. And how many terrorists were arrested, prosecuted, tried? None. None. Not one person was even alleged. You would think if they were smart, they might actually just suggest that someone was a terrorist to justify their policy. But no, with admirable honesty, they say we stopped 101,000 people under these powers, and not one of them could even be suggested to be a terrorist. What does that tell you about public policy in this country? To my mind, it demonstrates that this has nothing to do with terrorism. It was a way of hassling law-abiding members of the public and demonstrating who's in charge. Your papers, please. Where are you going? Who are you going to see there? Oh, a Libertarian Alliance event sounds very suspicious. What's going to be said? Your freedom of speech, your freedom of association, your freedom, in my view, to move in society with the presumption of innocence without the state peering over your shoulder. And now, if that wasn't enough, telephone calls and emails come next. Now, I say in semi-defence of the coalition, they have now suspended that power of stop and search at random for pedestrians, but continue that power of random stop and search for vehicles. And so my strong suspicion is that when the Office of the Surveillance Commissioner next reports about surveillance, we will see a large spike in the number of motorists that have been stopped in this country. Because, of course, that's a lobby that gets it really easy in the United Kingdom these days. The motorist just has such an easy time of it in the United Kingdom, we better pick on him some more. The other thing to stress, I suppose, about that is that the so-called Office of the Surveillance Commissioner, which looks after you and me in this area of public life, has been with us now for 4 years. In their last annual report, having had a budget that you and I would die for in terms of their operation and a nice office and pensions and building and so forth, in their 4th annual budget, they released their report into surveillance and they announced that unlawful surveillance conducted by the state, surveillance that should never have been authorised, should never have been carried out, had gone up under his reign. That is to say, after 4 years of his valiant effort at your and my expense, there's more unlawful surveillance being conducted than there has been before. I was sitting in the studio in Radio 4 to discuss this, and opposite me was an empty chair. The Surveillance Commissioner refused to discuss his own report on air. That is to say, the person who's supposed to bring transparency to this area of national life he's not even responding to somebody else's suggestions, won't discuss his own report. That's the state in modern Britain today. Now, anonymity is not a crime in this country, but you'd be mistaken for thinking that it was. What is it that brings a government that announces very shortly before the election that it wants to reverse the rise of the surveillance state to this point very, very soon afterwards, where it reintroduces the Intercept modernisation programme? Let me make a few suggestions. First of all, I think there is the power of the civil servant. The speed of bureaucratic capture that has happened with this government is so fast it will make your head spin. So, one, look at what you can do, Minister. Wouldn't it be useful if? Wouldn't it be useful? You've got to appreciate how helpful it would be to us on a bureaucratic level to be able to tie up A to B to C. And it's complete unwillingness, unaware nature of our ministers today that maybe it's not a good idea to allow the state to tie up A, your telephone records, to B, your home address, to C, your medical records, which is another area of government expansion. So first of all, wouldn't it be useful? Is something ministers have been told from day one. But two, and this is the great Sir Humphreyism, now that you're a minister, we can show you the real stuff. Now you're a minister, here are the files, Minister. Take a look at what's really happening. Look at how gravely in danger we are in this country. And thirdly, of course, Minister, you've got to appreciate the costs of cancellation would really be very significant if you start cancelling these programmes now. We've got all these contracts signed up and you can't go back. That was the answer offered on the summary care record, which is everyone's medical data being aggregated into one database, which will be breached. Government's never built a database it can look after. Anonymity in your medical data, of course, doesn't exist, but privacy in your medical data certainly should, from your fellow man, people in your neck of the woods. That's gone up the spout. The government has reintroduced the summary care record, which is the large data of your medical information, that large database, which again was suspended by the very authoritarian Labour government. And thirdly, the costs of cancelling this sort of intercept modernisation. There will have been some costs, I'm sure. But my answer to that will be, so what? The ongoing cost to me as a citizen, I actually prefer subject, but fine, me as a citizen in this country, and you and me as citizens in this country, of being monitored by the state perennially, outweigh the short-term cost of having to cancel these contracts. And indeed, of course, the ongoing costs of trying to listen to everyone's phone calls and emails would vastly outweigh any cost of cancelling a contract. There is another way. In the one and only plug, I promise you, in my address, Dominic Raab, new Member of Parliament, has written a pamphlet called Fight Terror, Defend Freedom, published coincidentally by Big Brother Watch. I commend it to you. I couldn't bring too many copies, but they're in that little room next door, which I'm sure has a suitably liberal name. I can't remember what it is, but they're in that little room. Thank you very much. They're in the Lady Violet room. Do have a look, because therein you will see that Dominic Raab, at an event that we had launched by David Davis, sets out his perspective on how we can do without listening to telephone calls and emails, without control orders, without the abject monitoring of the citizen that we have in this country, and still defend freedom. So as I say, I commend it to you. One word to say about control orders, under which you're not anonymous, but your accuser is. We've had 45 control orders in this country in the history of that power being in existence, justified on the basis that the Home Office tell us there are some 2,000 known terrorist suspects in this country. We can't prove anything, but we know you're up to something. Some 2,000 people who should be suspected, and a further 2,000 who are effectively, in a Donald Rumsfeld term, known unknowns. That is to say, we know there's probably the same amount again, but we can't tell you who they are. Highly scientific from the Home Office, I'm sure. But let's take their facts as given. 4,000 active terrorists, 45 people ever given control orders, of whom, by the way, 7 absconded, so secure control orders, and 9 people remain under control orders, under which your freedom of movement and your freedom of association are curtailed. You have no right to know even what you're accused of, let alone the nature and details of those accusations, or even who has accused you. Truly, in my view, Kafkaesque. And the fact that it happens to a tiny proportion of people in this country does nothing to justify it. If you are not free, I am not free. And once these things can happen in principle, they can happen in principle to any of us. And particularly when the state does not have to justify what it's done, it genuinely can happen to any of us, because there is no objective standard by which the state, or to which the state can be held. And that's why, in my opinion, despite the fact that these 9 individuals, because they are the poster boys for the government's and the last government's campaign, no doubt can, if you don't hold it to any criminal standard, have some mud thrown at them, in my view, none of them should be on control orders. And finally, on that subject, it seems to me pathetic intellectually to keep these orders in place when every time the government goes to court on them, the government rightly loses. So they're just waiting out these last 9 people's liberty in order to keep them on them for longer until they get into court and then lose on them. How can that intellectually or morally be justified for a moment? And as I say, it could happen to you, because the state has been held to no objective standard at all in curtailing those people's liberty. So as I say, in my view, these are bad times, depressingly quickly, for the cause of freedom under this new government. And worse, in my view, this is the high point of the government's commitment to freedom. Things will only go downhill from here. That is because, one, the pressure of everyday events. You've got to respond to something. You may have seen that some explosives have been found on a Midlands plane coming out of Yemen this very day. And I have no doubt that there will be another authoritarian knee-jerk reaction to that as a result of the discovery. Two, connected to that, the need to be seen to be doing something. The government must do something. Nobody in politics seems anymore be willing to say there is an element of risk in life that cannot be eliminated. Government shouldn't try to do everything. These are notions that are absent anymore in our public discourse. And thirdly, the terrorist threat in our country seems to overwhelm everything, every potential, apart from, I suppose, the threat of paedophilia, with which we are similarly obsessed in this country. But apart from putting paedophilia aside, we are obsessed with terrorism in this country, and we will bow down to or bend over, whichever analogy you prefer, to the state whenever that is voiced as a potential threat. So as I say, we are now at the high point of this government's commitment to freedom, which I think is rather worrying. And it's for that reason that I think all the reviews that the government have announced into stop and search and control orders and 28-day detention and CCTV and automatic number plate recognition and the DNA database, we're going to review all of these things. Why? Because you can long grass it for a while and let the bureaucrats have their say and then say, well, of course we did say we would be scrapping things before the election, but now we've got into government and we've seen the real picture where we've got to be responsible, and I'm afraid we can't do all that we promised. In my view, the series of reviews that have been announced are a disaster for freedom rather than an opportunity for freedom. If government wants to seize the chance to help us with freedom, it should axe things immediately. And that's what, and I see Steve Baker is here, I know proudly voted for it. That's why I commend every member of Parliament that helped us get rid of ID cards for British citizens. But not, of course, for foreign nationals. So my wife, for example, now still has, who's Australian, still has to fingerprint and thumbprint at Heathrow. Let me simply make the point on that basis. Anonymity is, of course, completely out the window when those sort of databases are built. When you have the apparatus in place, when you have the personnel trained to use the apparatus, when function creep begins and people use these cards for more and more things, once they become increasingly commonplace as a form of establishing your identity, the number of us required to have them, that's just a practicality. That's not the most important issue. The most important issue is whether or not they are commonly in circulation and can commonly be read and used. And that is already the case in this country. As I say, if you are not free, I am not free. And foreign nationals in this country now, who are either here legally or illegally, if they're here legally, they've got a passport and can prove their identity to the satisfaction of the immigration authorities. And if they're here illegally, how likely do you think it is they're going to take up an ID card? But if foreign nationals are not free, you as a British citizen are not free. Or as a European Union citizen. Of course, that occurs to me as an afterthought, as I wish it did to our politicians. But there we are. If you are not free, I am not free. The point that I'm trying to make about Intercept Modernisation Programme, the development of identity cards, and so forth, is that not only is it a gross infringement of your freedom and liberty, not only does it destroy the notion of anonymity from the state unless you've been proven to do anything wrong, not only does it reverse the presumption of innocence, but it doesn't achieve anything on its own terms. It doesn't help one iota in advancing the fight against terrorism. If you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, stop growing the haystack. Stop making the haystack ever bigger. That's why the absurdity of body scanners needs to be highlighted in society today. There's a different kind of anonymity, the anonymity of what's inside. An anonymity that really gets violated by the state now if you are unlucky enough to be picked out of the line to go through the body scanner. The more data you accumulate on individuals, the harder it is to find out which individuals you should be concerned about. And that's why, again in the Raab pamphlet, looking at in the Intercept Modernisation Programme, trying to listen to people's telephone calls and emails, is such a ridiculous idea. because this government and the last government refused to allow intercept evidence that they've already accumulated to be used in court cases against alleged terror suspects. That is to say, evidence that can be individually accumulated and overseen on the basis of a sign-off by a senior officer or a judge or even a minister, properly accountable surveillance of a specific individual named, and that surveillance would have to be justified in court on a warranted basis. They won't use that kind of individual specified surveillance, but what kind of surveillance do they want to use? Surveillance of all of us, all of the time, everyone's telephone calls, everyone's emails, just in case, when nothing's been proven against you. In my view, it seems to me that is entirely the wrong way round. And it's the wrong way round even on one of the things they object to, which is cost. We are told, absurdly, that we couldn't use surveillance evidence in this country in court because of the cost. Well, £500 million has been set aside for covert surveillance, which I'm sure will be used for the Intercept modernisation programme. That cost vastly outweighs any real use of surveillance evidence in court, in my view. I see the time. I know we started late, but I'll get you guys back on schedule by wrapping up a little early. But I just want to point to three further examples, I say, of the loss of anonymity in British life at the moment, before closing. And it may seem strange to say this, ladies and gentlemen, but anonymity is not a crime, even in the world of Facebook and social networking. And tell me your postcode and your mother's maiden name. Yeah, anonymity is still not a crime in this country, thank God. Three further examples. Covert surveillance by local councils. May seem strange to you it's even being done. We at Big Brother Watch established that there were some 8,500 separate such operations carried out in this country over the last 2 years. And for what? Not for serious crimes, not for terrorism, for leaving your bin out on the wrong day, for fouling, for your dog fouling the pavement. You fouling the pavement might be different, I suppose. For your dog fouling the pavement, for people breaking the smoking ban. This is the sort of thing that covert surveillance by local councils is being done. Or the example you no doubt know about, supposedly lying about the catchment area you live in. For school, because we've got the for people who aren't from the UK, we've got the socialist education system, where if you live in A, you have to go to school A. Councils oversee that and allege sometimes that people are lying about it because rather than try to improve schools, the argument is let's make sure that people have to go to those kinds of schools. That'll improve it, of course. Jenny Patton down in Poole was alleged to have lied about the school catchment area she lives in. As it happens, she hadn't lied. But even if she had, is it proportionate to use what you think covert surveillance is? That is what they were using. Telephoto lenses, people hiding in the bushes, following people in cars, noting down where they went and who they met with for weeks, on the basis that they were supposedly lying about their school catchment area. Anonymity genuinely no longer exists when that kind of power is given to the state, to the local council, not James Bond. You know, this is your local Jobsworth councillor on steroids, watching you through the bushes. And the logs, as I've seen, read like this. Subject A, the mother, met with subject B, the daughter. They got into target vehicle Alpha, the family for Mondeo, and went to location 1, the school. And on it went with these petty bureaucrats. So one, covert surveillance by local councils. That's a power they shouldn't have at all, in my view. The coalition has said they're going to require a warrant process, which I suppose is better than nothing, because at the moment, local councils self-authorise. Jobsworth says to Jobsworth B, shall we watch Sean Gabb? Jobsworth B says, yes, of course we will. And that's the authorisation process over and done with. And let me say, by the way, if you're amongst the 90+% of people who are watched by the state in that way, and are found to be innocent of this non-crime for which you can't even be arrested, you have no right to know that you were watched. So again, it could have happened to you. Because any of us can be the subject of an untrue allegation of leaving the bin out on the wrong day. Any of us can be the subject of an untrue allegation of being a noise nuisance. It could have happened to you. And you would have no right to know how you or your family was watched by your local council. That was example 1. Example 2, which we can get into in Q&A if you're interested in it, but I think is another gross example of intrusion in this country. It's closed-circuit television monitoring of everyone, all the time, just in case. I'm not a Luddite, but I think the level of surveillance in this country is completely out of proportion with anything that could be justified on any objective policing basis. It's about accumulating data about individuals by the state, and it's about showing who's in charge. It's not about crime solving. At best for councils, it's about revenue raising from motorists, which is not why many of these cameras were installed in the first place. Thirdly and finally, that we have an organisation in this country, I just want to alert you to this as good libertarians. The so-called National Institute for Clinical Excellence is nothing of the kind. It is one of the worst organisations for driving intrusion into personal liberty and freedom under the cover of looking after you, which is of course the worst kind of tyranny, when tyranny comes and says it's for your own good. You can fight off the robber barons because you can see the robber barons' ill intent, but when you get smothered to death with cotton wool, it's harder to put up a fight. NICE last year proposed a database of every house in the country with someone in it under the age of 15 so that they could help to accident-proof the house. That is to say, make sure you don't you need a power socket that needs covering up, or a stair guard needs to be installed here so that people don't fall down. And quite rightly, they were laughed out of business. And so they came back this year and said, OK, then, we'll have a database of everyone with a household with someone aged under 5. So they changed their terms but said, we still want to have this database, which in the end will grow up into being a database of every household in the country, introduced for your own good. And of course you'll have the right to refuse entry to our inspectors. It's only voluntary. But I wonder what it would say about someone who refuses right to entry when we're just trying to look after children. That's very worrying, isn't it? You'll then go on to a separate database of people we're concerned about. Do look for that kind of example in years to come, because they won't give up unless and until their powers are drastically cut, which they should be, their budgets are drastically cut, which it should be, or best of all, they're banned, which they won't be. So I hope I've given you a flavour of how anonymity, despite not being a crime, in this country is increasingly treated as if it is.